In this final application lecture, we're going to look more in depth at the monopsony that we've talked briefly about in terms of the NFL and the monopsony they have in the labor market. We're going to talk also about the NFL and the monopoly that they have on the product market. So we're going to look at both ends of the spectrum, the NFL in terms of being a business that actively participates in the resource market and in the product market. So to start off, let's remind ourselves, thinking about the product market, we're actually going to see that the NFL has a monopoly on professional football in the United States. And what we're talking about here is in the product market, the NFL supplies professional football games to the United States. If you want to watch a professional football game in the United States, either in person or on TV, it must be an NFL game. And so they have a monopoly. They're the single seller of professional football games in the United States. And so we know that this is going to affect the product market by having an increased price. When there's only one seller in the market, they become a price maker. They have control over the price, and as a price maker, they can set their prices above that purely competitive equilibrium price. So when we're thinking about when we're thinking about the product market for professional football, we see a monopoly occurring. Prices are above those equilibrium prices. Okay, so they're not only when we're thinking about the price maker aspect, they set the price of tickets, they set the price of how much ABC or ESPN has to pay to have their games viewed on those channels. And also, if you want to purchase any clothing or accessories, they set the price of that. And so the NFL is heavily involved in setting the prices of all of the different aspects that go into the NFL games and anything else that you might want to view in terms of a professional football game. And so since they have all this control, they can set the prices, and the prices are set above the competitive equilibrium. So if we had many professional football associations competing for your viewership, it would start to lower the price of all of these different items because they would be competing for your viewership. They'd want you to have your favorite team under that association rather than their competitors. All right. When we move into the resource market, now the NFL becomes the purchaser, the buyer of labor. They demand professional football players' labor. And we see that in the United States, if somebody wants to play professional football, they have one option. They have to play for the NFL. They're the sole demander, and I say that they have to play. A lot of people want to play, right? They want to play for the NFL, but they only have that option. And that allows the NFL to be a wage maker. They're going to set the wages that are available for football players. And as a buyer or as a demander of those professional football players' labor, they're going to prefer low prices. And so the NFL sets the wage rate lower than if there were other buyers in the market. So if there were competing associations, what we would actually see is that those football players would have higher wages than they do currently under this one firm system. And again, this is because there aren't any close substitutes and labor is very immobile. So it's hard for professional football players to move into a new location, right? Even if they do move to Canada or Europe, those professional associations aren't as high quality as what most would consider the NFL. And so there's no close substitutes in terms of what's their next best option. And there's no close substitutes in that they're not very mobile and can move to a new location to find a better employer. Okay, so when we start to think about these barriers to entry, why don't we have another association? Why isn't there another professional football association? And so remember, when we're thinking about those barriers to entry, can a new firm actually enter into the market? Well, one reason why we said new firms couldn't enter into the market is that there was a government restriction. There was a patent or copyright. Well, that's not the case in the NFL. There's no government restriction saying that there can only be one NFL. There's not really also an economies of scale problem because, I mean, there is a little bit in terms of a stadium, but not really a big. The startup cost for an NFL is not that large, and so I don't know that there's too much of an economies of scale problem. It would take a little bit of time for ESPN and ABC to cover your games, but with the internet, we can all have access to the internet, and so that wouldn't be quite as difficult. The NFL doesn't own all of the factors of production. They don't own all the land, the labor, or the capital. And so that's also not the case. So what is keeping others out of the market? So we actually did have a competitor, the United States Football League, the USFL, was a competitor to the NFL. And if you watch, I have a link posted to a 30 by 30 ESPN documentary called Small Potatoes, which I think is an excellent documentary that has so much economics, and I know that makes you all want to jump out and watch it, but has so much economics in there. But we're going to talk a little bit about how the USFL affected the market for both football players and also just the professional game as a whole. So the USFL came about for three primary reasons. Both the year before, the NFL had a strike. The football players were on strike, and they were looking for an alternative. There was the rise of cable TV with new cable TV channels, new outlets available for viewing games. It became logical to have another alternative to the USFL. And also there was an increased demand for football. As people started to shift their preferences away from baseball and towards football, there became a greater demand for having football actually all year round. And what we saw was the NFL was in its current time slot, and the USFL actually played in the spring league. And the USFL was challenged the NFL as the fun league, and so they had a lot going on in their games. They had girls in bikinis in the stands, and fans were allowed to charge the stadium when their team won. They had exciting plays and players. There were guns going off at the games, all kinds of crazy things going on that the NFL didn't have, and so it really engaged their viewership and got people having fun at their games. All right, so originally there were 12 cities that signed up for the USFL team, and 9 already had NFL teams. And so what we can see here is that the USFL wasn't just moving into markets that were completely open and had no professional teams. There was actually some overlap in between the USFL and the NFL. 6 more teams were added in 1984, and they actually signed contracts to have games played on ABC and ESPN. And so what we see are these economies of scale problems that we thought might have been occurring aren't really occurring. We're seeing a lot of success here. And in the first year, 10 of the 12 teams exceeded the goal of 18,000 tickets sold per game. And so we start to see a lot of success occurring with the USFL. But obviously something not good is going to happen because we don't know about the USFL anymore. So we're not going to talk about that piece of the puzzle, and you might see a clip if you take a look at that Small Potatoes, see a viewing of our current president. But I'll leave that to watch the movie. But let's talk about what the USFL did for labor market wages. So I claim currently that NFL players earn a market price or earn a market wage that's below what the competitive equilibrium would charge. And so what we see when the USFL was actually present in the labor market, there was a bidding war on many NFL players. So the NFL was competing with the USFL to get the top players and coaches. And so the USFL paid higher wages in order to encourage some of the players and coaches to move away from the NFL. They were signing big names, so Reggie White, Jim Kelly, Steve Young, all big football players during the time. They also signed the Heisman winners from 1982, 83, and 84. And so what we can see are many of the top players of the time were also choosing to go to the USFL. So increased competition in this market. And what we can see is right now, and we're just going to have this very simplistic here with our supply curve and our demand curve and our equilibrium. When we add an additional buyer to the market. Now, instead of just having the NFL demanding labor, we also have the USFL. It's going to shift that demand curve to the right. As we shift the demand curve to the right, it drives up the equilibrium wage and drives up the equilibrium quantity. And so now we have more football players, which just makes sense because now we have two leagues, more football players that are able to play, and then also we're paying them higher wages. So wages and jobs both increase as a result of the USFL entering into the market. All right, so, and let's see if this is actually the case. In the 3 years that the USFL existed, NFL wages tripled. And so you can really see the effect that monopsony on the labor market has when there's only one firm, as opposed to just one more additional association coming in and competing with the NFL, tripling the wages. We think that the professional football players have high wages now, but with increased competition, those wages would actually be even higher. And just an example of one of the extreme examples, a backup quarterback in the NFL made $60,000, moved to the USFL, and as a starting quarterback earned $400,000. So we can see how those wages, as the USFL bringing more competition to the market, drives up wages. And that $400,000 starting wage was going to be more than Super Bowl winners in the NFL at the time. So the NFL was forced to raise their wages, otherwise they would lose all of their workers, and I'm going to call them workers, our professional athletes, to the USFL. All right, so it not only increased the wages, but it also allowed for increased innovation. And we talked a little bit about this previously, but when we start to see firms compete, right, we saw that the USFL challenged the NFL as being the fun league. And so another reason why we like to see competition in markets is that it allows for innovation. So the USFL is also attributed to our 2-point conversion, instant replay, and challenging officials' rulings on the field. So not just increasing the wages of the workers, moving them towards a more efficient, competitive equilibrium, but also increased innovation for the game as a whole. And so that kind of gives us a little bit of a background into the monopsony and monopoly that the NFL has over both the resource and the product market. So what I want you to remember as you're going forward and preparing for this quiz, this optional quiz, this material will not be covered on the exam, is the difference between the labor market and the product market. When we're talking about the product market, businesses supply households with the products. When we're talking about the resource market, businesses purchase those factors of production from households. And so that's very important and key to remember. At what time is a business a demander and at what point are they a supplier?